Hi, I'm George, and this is the lo-fi prototype demo of Verne. I'll go through the demo with my primary persona of backend developer. So let's share screen. Starting off, Verne is a literature publishing website with a focus on collaboration with your readers. So our inspiration is actually the book The Martian, which was later adapted to a movie. The writer, Andy Weir, published the book as a web serial. With each chapter that he serially published, he would get a lot of feedback from his readers, getting scientific corrections so he could improve each story, each chapter, and then make the next chapter even better. So this is our home page. This still has dummy content at this point, but let's sign in with Google. For this, we had to sign up. We had to set up another API endpoint for authentication. And we're also using the NextAuth library. So let's just use this Google account. And now you can see that once I'm signed in, these two buttons open up. They're not disabled anymore. So let's go to write. The write button takes us to the create chapter page, which again, you can only do if you're signed in. There's some bugs that we'll sort out later. Right now, we don't give authors many options for the metadata they can set for their story. Right now, we just allow them to add chapter name, but let's do, I don't know, my spring break. Okay, and there's a preview here. And when we hit create, a few things happen. The website sends a post request to an API endpoint that we set up. And that endpoint uses the Google Drive API in node.js to create a Google Doc in the Google Drive of a Google account that we set up just for this project. Additionally, we use the Drive API because that doc is sort of in that specific account's drive, we also need to use the Drive API to share editing access to the author who created the work. Everyone else, by default, has suggesting power. So we can see that here. Now I'm signed in as the author, here. Let's just write some stuff here. And right in this view chapter page, the author is able to write, edit their work. And as you'll see in a moment, readers can suggest. But why don't we just start off the story, just some dummy text here. Let's say that's our title. It was dark and stormy night. I was eating dinner. And now let's switch accounts to see what the reader sees. This switch account is currently broken. So what we actually do is we can change Google account like this. So you see this changes to a different account. This is my school email now. The prior one was a personal email. And you can see that whereas the author account could write, I only have permission to suggest or view. So let's say this is a cliche. Let's just very cliche beginning. And we leave that comment there. And then, if we switch to the author again, we can actually see that comment. So we can do, oh, I agree, apply. Let's change that to something else. It was a dark and stormy night. It was a wonderful spring break so far. And that kind of resolves the comment. Anyways, for other pages, let's go to profile. So this page retrieves the chapters that are associated with whichever author whose page you're on. We can visit another person, see what works they have. And the way this profile page works, along with the create chapter page, I guess no stories on this one. We can go back to the previous page. on the create chapter page, along with using the Drive API, we also have a NoSQL table set up. We use Firestore, a NoSQL service from Google Cloud or Firebase. And on the create chapter page, after we create the doc and share the doc with the author using Google Drive API, we also insert a row of metadata into our NoSQL table. This is the stuff that's there so far. And these sort of preview cards, you can just click on them to jump to the corresponding view chapter page. Now, in terms of so far, we're very happy that we've figured out our page organization. We understand, we've also set up our Node.js API. We're happy that we figured out many libraries. We're using Next.js for front-end development and routing, NextAuth for signing with Google, Google Drive API to handle the docs and doc permissions, as well as our Firestore client-side library. We're happy that we've figured much of that out, but there's still work to be done. So, as mentioned before, we don't want to just only allow the authors to create individual chapters. We want to let them compile them into books. And those will just sort of, we'll need to set up a new NoSQL table. They will store the chapters in order that the author wants to add. We'll need to make new pages for that, like view chapter. That'll look similar to the profile page where it'll just display a grid of cards for the stories in that book. We also need a create book page. That could be simple, just create a title and then select which of your chapters you want to add. And then we also need delete story functionality. So this will be a little more involved. We'll need to use the Google Drive API to delete the doc and also use our Firestore library to delete that row. And then beyond that, we definitely want to touch every page up. So especially exemplified by the create chapter page, sort out bugs like this too, especially evidenced by the create chapter page. Pretty limited content and components on each page, just the minimum required to crank this MVP out. But once we do that, we'll be ready to deploy, and we'll use Vercel, which is a website hosting service that integrates very nicely with sites written in Next.js. So thank you for watching this demo, and we're excited to work more on it.